when you do need a full campaign, given that it's difficult to find people to get in front of them, they have so many competing forms of media and things coming at them, different technologies, you do need to be highly targeted.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for Republican campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. Our guest today is Sara Fagen, founder and CEO of Tunnl, a data intelligence company powering brand, purpose-driven, and issue advocacy efforts. Sara is also the co-founder of Resonate and Deep-Root Analytics. She was Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Political Affairs for President George W. Bush, whom she also served as Senior Strategist on the Bush-Cheney 04 reelect. In today's conversation, we discuss her journey to entrepreneurship, the evolving role of data in campaigns, and advice she has for balancing multiple projects at once. Sara, you had two very big roles at the White House and Bush-Cheney 04. It's not a totally clear or obvious path from there to three-time entrepreneur. How did that leap come about?
Well, it really came about because of the opportunity and the transformation that was happening, before all of us back in 2004 technologically. And so just a quick story, I was the deputy strategist on the campaign. I reported to Matt Dowd. I helped oversee, all things polling, media buying, media production. And at one point, we allocated about $250,000 of digital video persuasion ads. And we had Mrs. Bush film these great spots about education. And we were going to test them and we were deploying them onto video platforms. And keep in mind, this is 2004. So
I'm trying to figure out what video platforms are there in 2004 online.
I mean, it was difficult to find them. It was difficult to measure them. It took I think a week to upload them and maybe 30 days to get information back, if my memory serves me correct. And the long and the short of it is we basically threw our hands in the air at one point and said, let's just put the money on TV. It was just so hard. And at the same time, we were undergoing this initiative that is now widely known as micro-targeting. In the corporate world, people would call it segmentation analysis, or, in the old days, the prism clusters, whatever your sort of flavor or word of choice is. We underwent a process to be better about identifying voters who were persuadable and who were supportive, but maybe had a low propensity to turn out. And I just remember thinking in my office one day in that campaign that at some point, these two things are going to converge. And it's probably in the next 10 years. And it was exciting to me and I wanted to be a part of it. And so that's really how I got the bug. And then I would say also, just broadly speaking, campaigns, at least especially a presidential campaign, and increasingly because of the funding, Senate and gubernatorial campaigns are very entrepreneurial. They are like startups. A presidential campaign is like building a Fortune 50 enterprise, in a matter of 18 months if you're successful in a primary. And so, there is a lot of the same kind of energy, excitement, risk, fear, all the emotions that go into a presidential campaign, you will experience building a business. And so in some ways, they're very translatable. But yes, most people leave the White House and become lobbyists or run corporate affairs offices for major companies. And I liked being in charge of.
You weren't exhausted enough after
exactly.
presidential reelect and working in the White House.
Yes.
It's interesting because we see two types of entrepreneurs, people who I went to business school and I know how a profit and loss statement works and, I'm going to run a business. And then the people who, in your case, are drawn to business as a way to achieve a goal and to accomplish something. And so I think that's really important for our listeners to understand that there's not a right or wrong way to arrive at entrepreneurship.
There isn't. And, to some degree, feel like I've gotten my MBA through the School of Hard Knocks. And I remember actually when I was leaving the White House, so I was, probably 31, still pretty young, certainly very eligible as an MBA candidate. And I fought very hard about going, to go get my degree. And I was considering an option at Lehman Brothers at the time, which is a whole other story that didn't work out, thankfully.
Dodged that bullet.
Right. But I called Phil Graham, Senator Graham, who was at UBS at the time and maybe still is. And his great Texas drawl, and I had worked for him in 1996, and his great Texas drawl was basically like, Sara, that is the dumbest idea. He said, do you know how valuable your Rolodex is? Like, just go out and work. Like, you don't need to go to business school. And certainly it's taken me a long time to learn my way around a financial statement. And I've had to learn all that, just by doing it. And there's certainly benefits to having gone to business school to pick up those skills quicker. But I've learned them without an MBA. And I don't think you have to have one to be successful.
And that's sort of my assessment too, just candidly. I think in many ways, good MBA programs are network accelerators, right? So yes, you get some technical knowledge and skills, but you're really meeting a lot of other entrepreneurial people, which, by the way, the West Wing of the White House is a great place to meet other really entrepreneurial, ambitious people. So
yes.
You obviously are really focused on the data space in politics. You were there in the early days of micro-targeting. Talk to us about how data has transformed politics over your time in the business.
Well, certainly when we started doing micro-targeting for political campaigns, it was a pretty static process. We did a large sample survey. We did some, matching on the back end. We built segmentation. We did segmentation analysis and built audiences, and it was largely used for mail and phones. And certainly over the last 20 years, the digital space has evolved. Social, has evolved and has become, from a digital perspective, a great ROI for getting a message out. And then in the TV space, which is where our company was founded, Tunnl, and really Deeproot was founded as a media optimization company. And we formed it in part to support the Romney campaign in 2012, because they, of course, were getting ready to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on TV. And it was the only thing there was no data for. There's data for digital, lots of flavors, some better than others. There's data for social, same thing, but there really is very little data to support broadcast television. And so we set out with the ambitious notion of being able to basically take micro-targeting to the next level and use it to help shape a television buy. And so, we've seen kind of it come full circle from, we've built out, a more sophisticated voter contact list to being able to, shape a multi-$100 million TV buy for a presidential campaign. And then, what we see now is folks in the public affairs and even in the brand space, because of what's just happening in the country, is that they are having to think about politics, and at least small p politics, not necessarily partisan or, what candidate or brand isn't getting behind a candidate.
Although increasingly more and more politics, big P politics seeping into corporate work as well.
It is. And companies are being forced to think about issues in a way, in 20 years ago, they never would have. And 10 years ago, they would have figured out a way to get out of it. Today, they're stepping into it because in some cases, their employees are demanding it. Their customers are demanding it. And so, for those of us with the knowledge of politics and how to massage a message and put together, a thoughtful audience, there's a real opportunity to serve a wider audience and help them solve some of their challenges.
And so at the same time that we've seen data really take over this space, we're seeing a reaction, I think it's fair to call it, from consumers with privacy concerns. And it's always interesting to me because no one had any concerns about micro-targeting when it happens in the mailbox, but when it's happening on your cell phone, that's when it crosses the line. How are we seeing that the pendulum swing with regards to data and privacy concerns?
Well, certainly I think there's a whole bunch of cross currents here. And kind of fundamentally, it remains an open question, although certainly state laws suggest the country is settling on a viewpoint. I think at a high level, are we a GDPR society that looks at data as a fundamental human right, like food and water and air? Yeah, and
Right.
that's very much the view in Europe, where everything is opt-in. So
And
far,
California.
yeah. Well, so far in the United States, we've taken the approach where this is a regulatory process. People absolutely have the right to opt out of being communicated with, to having their information sold, and so in that environment, companies are able to continue to operate as long as they do so ethically. And part of that is to make sure that you have compliance procedures in place to respect people's wishes. There's a whole other group of Americans that say, yeah, I don't really love ads or text messages always, but I do. There's a lot of things I get for free that I like getting for free, and I'm okay with the trade-off. And so therein lies the balancing act. And I think for players in the data and analytics space, and even people who are more downstream sort of processors of data, like digital firms and others, really need to just be following best practices. Obviously follow the laws that exist in the states that have privacy laws, but then just have best practices. Don't leave PII, available to anybody in a company to access. It's got to be in a hardened case, where very limited people have access to it. Matching needs to be done in a privacy compliant way. These things all have to be, carefully thought through. And, there's a lot of best practices out there, and that you can, build a robust and successful business while respecting people's rights and following the laws.
Well, so while balancing all of these tactics and new technologies together for your clients, what's your guidance for them on determining the right mix between lobbying efforts, grassroots, grass tops, public relations, paid media, all the different levers that you have to pull? How do you guide them in that decision?
I think in the short term, there are issues that lend themselves very well to robust campaigns, and things like the Keystone Pipeline or tax fights, or sort of big public, well-known issues. Black Lives Matter is an example where you would want to go mobilize on behalf of the issue at hand. And it's easy to mobilize because there's a lot of passionate people who care about these issues. I think for now, if it's an arcane issue, it's something very specific that's the average person in the public isn't going to be paying attention to, or maybe even care that much about. Some of those kind of traditional lobbying tactics, make a lot of sense, and you don't need a full campaign. But when you do, given that it's difficult to find people, to get in front of them, they have so many competing forms of media and things coming at them, different technologies, that you do need to be highly targeted. And so when it's worth an investment, it's worth doing it right and putting some percentage of the budget to make sure that the broader spend is actually being conducted thoughtfully. And I see more and more folks doing that, public affairs efforts doing that, where data is a bigger part of these conversations. There are still plenty who are just kind of hoping for the best, hiring somebody and hoping that they're doing a good job of it. But the trend is definitely more toward being data-driven. I think kind of longer term, what we see is that there's so much activity in the low dollar fundraising that these members of Congress and other elected officials, who are ultimately the end goal of the influence campaign, there's a dynamic happening where I think lobbying as a whole is just going to become less effective, because when corporate PAC fundraising is an increasingly small percentage of donations, and 50, 60, 70% of a campaign's finances come from the internet and low dollar donors, there's going to be a marked shift in terms of like how campaigns around issues are conducted. And so in that case, I think companies and trade associations really need to be thinking long term about building out communities that are educated about the issues, passionate about the issues, and willing to take action, because they're going to need to leverage their stakeholder groups, their employees, their activists to achieve their public policy objectives.
I totally agree with that. And we've seen it time and time again. But a community with a cause is going to beat an organization with an agenda every day of the week. And I think another really fascinating takeaway here is that the counterbalance to corporate money in politics, as it's often called, was not to get rid of it, but was to dilute it with more grassroots money. And so that's a really interesting result that we've seen.
Yeah, I think it's certainly got a lot of positives about it. And, like all things, there's some downsides to it. I mean, I think a lot of the ways people are collecting those donations are through very strongly worded emotional emails. And, while at the core, this is true. And I think this is true across the board, at the core, the issue is correct, or you might agree with it, but the way that sometimes these committees are going about it, it's just a little cringeworthy, candidly. And that's, I don't think, necessarily helpful to the process, but it is where we are politically today, and it's effective.
Yeah, certainly trending in a different direction. You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Sara Fagen, founder and CEO of Tunnl. Sara, I'd like to get some specific strategies and tactics or tools that you use to lead multiple companies at the same time. How do you make it all happen?
First of all, I've always been good at just having like a prioritization in my head, of it's constantly shifting. So, what I wake up with that are the 4 or 5 most important things of my day might shift throughout the day, but I kind of always have that running list. And I keep that in business and in life. And it allows me to
do you
just
write
like
it
quickly
down,
prioritize.
or is it just in your head?
It's so increasingly as I've gotten older, I have to write it down, but I can't, I used to be able to keep track of 30 or 40 things in my head. I can still keep that top 10 list in my head and, be thinking about, I've got to move 6 up to 4 and get that done. So some of that is just, I don't know if I had, ADHD as a child, or like once you have it, you always have it. But I learned some coping skills as a young person to balance a lot of information. And then what I do is, as I've gotten older too, is like, I just listen a lot. And, things are rarely as good as they seem, and they are rarely as bad as they seem. And, when there's an employee whose hair is on fire, when there's an investor who's, overly rosy about something, I have just found that a more measured approach, is, keeps people calm and focused and moving forward. And so that's just more of a philosophical, approach. And then like I take advantage of a whole bunch of, tools, multiple different calendars that all integrate. I use Superhuman for email. I find that to be very effective in sorting out my various things that I'm involved in so that I can quickly go to the top and, spend 20 or 30 minutes focused on a particular entity or project. And I don't get overly stressed out about my to-do list. I've learned to live with a to-do list that is never ending. It is, it's not necessarily always growing, but is always voluminous. And I get as much done as I can, and I get the most important things done, and I can't worry about everything else. I've also had to delegate a lot. And, I think that for a manager is one of the hardest things to learn. And I try to always hire really great people and put them in charge and let them, have the responsibility and, not only the glory, but sometimes the failure, but also the glory. And when you operate that way, it tends to allow other people to flourish and allow the right environment inside your company as well.
So, Sara, you've been involved in a successful exit or market event for in the political space. I'm curious to hear your takeaways from that, and what are the keys to making that successful? Because a lot of the people we work with at Startup Caucus and our listeners are looking for that for their own company. So I think they would be eager to hear from someone who has been there and done it successfully.
Well, I think that there's no substitute for having a really great product or set of services. In the case of the company that I was a part of selling, which was DDC to Omnicom, we had great pack technology, and we also had best in class services to help fight some of these issue campaigns that people are experiencing. So I think there's no substitute for just having high quality people, high quality products, but then also hitting your numbers. And it's important to pace yourself on a business too, which is, there are times when you can accelerate revenue, which is of course always the goal. But, for instance, if you sell ahead of your product, you're likely going to lose some people. And then you have, a situation where you have churn or other things,
Sorry,
which are,
you mean selling
yeah,
selling ahead of a product where you're selling features that you're not able to deliver on?
correct, or that it's not fully baked or it's not meeting the client's needs, but you do a good job of selling it for the sake of getting a sale. That stuff is oftentimes comes back to bite you. And so I think being thoughtful about, yes, you got to hit numbers, you got to have a realistic financial and revenue plan, but you also have to be honest about where your business is and where the product is and what can you deliver for people. And I think that's where I've seen businesses sort of get in trouble. If they don't have a good product, they get in trouble. But sometimes even when they do have good products, they get in trouble because they have a really great sales team and they do a good job of selling it. But then if it's underwhelming, it's hard to reclose those sales in subsequent years. And that's important to be thinking about those things before you get out ahead of yourselves, so that you have what you want in a business is a steady, and this is very difficult in politics, and it's really impossible in campaign politics, but you want a steady upward growth trajectory. People will accept lumpy revenue in politics because it's obviously part of the cycle. They're much less likely to accept it when you're in a general market business or a public affairs business. Purchasers are going to be looking for steady upward growth.
They want to know that you have managed cash flows and growth and all of that sort of thing, and that you figured it out. And so that lumpiness can often be a sign that you haven't.
That's right.
On the other side of the spectrum, you're, I think by my count, a 3-time serial entrepreneur. What are the signals that you look for when it's time to start something new and break out into a new market segment or service? What are the signs or signals that you're looking for?
So I think when there's an unmet need in the marketplace, certainly one thing that we do a lot of at Tunnl is listening to customers. And once 2 or 3 people we work with start asking for the same thing, that's, a pretty good indication that there's a market for it. I've seen, kind of more thoughtful studies, done of the landscape where, you can make the case for a product's success or failure. But at the end of the day, building a technology company is just really, really, really hard. And yes, you want to make sure you get market feedback, but you also have to have, either as the entrepreneur yourself, but ideally more than one person and the team that is very knowledgeable and sophisticated, like a real point of view. And you've got to go out and create the market too sometimes. And so I always sort of look for pattern recognition in terms of need, but then also, when 2 or 3 of your best people are sitting around a room and like you all agree that something is needed and valuable, it doesn't mean it's always right. But, I think it's good to have a healthy skepticism. But generally, when you start to see alignment of a management team, like there's pretty good indication that these are the right moves. There are lots of things that people would like to do. They're not also always profitable. And that's the other thing that you have to kind of always stop and ask. Like lots of people build cool things that not very many people want to buy. And so that is like the skepticism I always bring to it. I have a partner who is really, really great and has had many successful exits. He's always a fan of selling to Congress. And I'm, this is one of these things where I disagree with him on. I'm like, there's only so many members, with franking rights. And, I think at times that's been very profitable for people. But it seems like maybe it's been less profitable in recent years. Or there's just been more competition, so I think those are the kinds of questions that you have to really challenge yourself with.
Well, Sara, what's a problem or area that you're not working on right now that you would be interested in seeing another entrepreneur tackle with their own startup or company?
Oh, it's a great question. I would love to see, for podcasts, the ability to really truly track audience and do ad insertions. Like that would be
Right.
great because there's such an influential audience usually. I know there's people
Certainly
flirting
the
around with
listeners
that.
of this podcast are very
Yes.
influential.
Yes. And the I would love to have the ability to bring that data into my business. I know there are people working on it. I think the same is true of, radio. One of the things we've just never really tackled it. It's something we talk about. There's always bigger priorities in the digital space. What we see in all of our surveys and even in our observed data is that traditional radio as a tactic is really under considered in a lot of these campaigns. And one of the reasons that people don't buy it is, on one hand, it's pretty hard to execute it still. Like it's pretty labor intensive, but there's also not a lot of great data to support who's listening to what with precision. And the digital, I think some of like the iHearts of the world are doing kind of proxy audiences from their digital platforms, and that has improved things. But being able to quantify radio the way we quantify TV would be really valuable.
Well, I think that's lots of homework for people who are listening, because that obviously that media optimization space and budgeting is a huge opportunity. I want to thank Sara Fagen for joining us today on the podcast for a fascinating conversation. You can learn more about Tunnl at their website with a link in our show notes. If you enjoyed today's episode, I want to ask you a quick favor. Please share it with a friend or colleague and help get more people listening to the podcast, but most importantly, bring more people into our industry, more entrepreneurs. There's lots of room, and by sharing the podcast, you help them learn about more opportunities. And finally, if you are a longtime listener, please do leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts, because that is the most helpful way to get new listeners, get discovered, and get more people into our industry. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.